The crystal chandeliers of the Pierre Hotel cast a golden glow over 200 of New York's most elite guests. Glasses clinked, laughter echoed, and the string quartet played a soft, elegant melody. But the moment the heavy mahogany doors swung open, the music abruptly stopped. A man stepped into the ballroom, flanked by 4 men in tailored black suits. He didn't say a word, but he didn't have to. The air was entirely sucked from the room. Forks clattered onto porcelain plates. Preston, the groom, turned pale as a ghost. Clara had just invited the most feared man on the eastern seaboard to a twin sister's wedding, and he brought a gift. Clara Hayes was always the shadow to a twin sister's sunlight, while Chloe Hayes was a former pageant queen with a blindingly perfect smile and a meticulously curated Instagram feed. Clara preferred the quiet solitude of her restoration studio in Chelsea. Chloe was marrying into the Carmichaels, a family of old-money hedge fund managers who summered in Nantucket and wore their generational wealth like a shield. Clara, on the other hand, spent her days meticulously removing centuries of grime from forgotten Renaissance oil paintings. Despite sharing the same piercing hazel eyes and ash-blonde hair, the twins lived in vastly different worlds. Chloe was all about status, appearances, and securing her future with Preston Carmichael. Preston was the golden boy of Wall Street, a man who wore custom Tom Ford suits and drove a vintage Aston Martin. On paper, the wedding was going to be the social event of the season, a lavish, $500,000 affair at the Pierre, completely paid for by Preston's domineering father, Richard Carmichael. But Clara had a secret of her own, a secret that wore bespoke Italian wool, drove a heavily armored Mercedes Maybach, and commanded an empire built on both legitimate shipping contracts and blood. His name was Dominic Cavallo. To the public, Dominic was the 34-year-old CEO of Cavallo Logistics, a booming freight and import-export conglomerate based in Brooklyn. To the FBI and the hushed whispers of the city's underground elite, he was the ruthless new head of the Cavallo Syndicate. He had taken over the family business after his father was gunned down outside a steakhouse in Little Italy 5 years prior. Since then, Dominic had modernized the syndicate. He didn't break kneecaps. He bankrupted companies, seized assets, and operated in the grey areas of international trade. He was a phantom, rarely photographed, completely untouchable, and deeply feared. Clara hadn't met him in a smoky back room or an underground casino. They had met 6 months ago at a private Sotheby's auction. Clara was there authenticating a damaged 17th century Venetian landscape. Dominic was there to buy it. He had outbid 3 Russian oligarchs, paying an exorbitant sum for a painting that, to the untrained eye, looked like ruined canvas. When Clara approached him after the auction to warn him that the restoration would take months and cost a small fortune, Dominic had simply looked at her with eyes as cold and dark as obsidian. "It was my mother's favorite piece before it was stolen in '98, he had said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that sent a shiver down her spine. "I don't care what it costs, Clara. Fix it." That professional arrangement quickly morphed into something entirely different. Dominic visited her studio late at night. He would sit in silence, drinking black coffee, watching her work under the harsh fluorescent lights. Beneath the terrifying reputation, Clara found a fiercely intelligent, surprisingly protective man who carried the weight of a violent empire on his shoulders. Their romance was a closely guarded secret, a fiery, intense collision of 2 entirely different worlds. Clara knew exactly who he was, and Dominic knew exactly how dangerous it was for her to be associated with him. A month before the wedding, the thick gold-embossed invitations arrived. Clara, sitting in the passenger seat of Dominic's Maybach, as it idled outside her apartment building, had tossed the heavy envelope onto the center console. "Chloe gave me a +1, Clara had said, a wry smile playing on her lips. "I think she expects me to bring my cat." Dominic had glanced at the intricate calligraphy, his jaw ticking. Carmichael. Richard Carmichael's kid. "Yes," Clara sighed, leaning her head against the leather seat. "Preston." He's a bit of a snob, but Chloe loves him. Or she loves the lifestyle. It's going to be a nightmare of forced smiles and condescending remarks from his family. They already think the Hayes family is beneath them because my dad was a public school teacher. Dominic picked up the invitation, his thumb tracing the gold foil. "Do you want me there?" Clara had laughed out loud, a genuine ringing sound. "Dominic, you're the head of the Cavallo family. You don't go to society weddings and eat miniature crab cakes. Besides, if you walked in, I think Richard Carmichael would have a heart attack." Dominic didn't laugh. His dark eyes locked onto hers, an unreadable expression masking his features. "Maybe I want to eat miniature crab cakes, Clara." "I'm serious," she said, her smile fading as she realized he wasn't joking. "You can't come. It's dangerous for you, and it would completely overshadow Chloe's day. Just pretend I didn't show you that." Dominic had slipped the invitation into his jacket pocket. "We'll see." Clara hadn't pushed it. Over the next 4 weeks, as the wedding frenzy consumed her sister, Dominic never brought it up again. Clara assumed the idea had been forgotten. Buried under the mountain of syndicate business and shipping logistics Dominic dealt with daily. She had no idea that Dominic had spent those 4 weeks doing a deep dive into the financial records of the Carmichael family, and what he found was about to turn the social event of the year into a nightmare. The morning of the wedding was a chaotic blur of hairspray, spilled champagne, and frantic bridesmaids. The bridal suite at the Pierre overlooking Central Park was practically vibrating with nervous energy. Chloe looked ethereal in a custom Bertha gown, the delicate lace and intricate beadwork hugging her perfect figure. Yet, despite her flawless appearance, her hands were shaking. "He's pacing," Chloe whispered to Clara as the makeup artist applied the final touches to her lipstick. "I just saw Preston in the hallway. He looked like he was about to throw up. And his father." Chloe swallowed hard. "Richard has been screaming into his phone all morning in the lobby. Something about a margin call and offshore accounts." Clara frowned, placing a reassuring hand on her twin's shoulder. "It's just wedding day jitters, Chloe, and Richard is always screaming about money. It's his only personality trait." "I suppose," Chloe sighed, though her eyes remained anxious. "I just want today to be perfect. The Carmichaels have judged us from day one, Clara. They think we're white trash gold diggers. If anything goes wrong today, I'll never hear the end of it." "Nothing will go wrong," Clara lied smoothly. As Clara slipped into her own dress, a tasteful, understated emerald green silk gown, she couldn't help but check her phone. No messages from Dominic. She hadn't seen him in 5 days. He had sent a brief text saying he had to handle a dispute at the Brooklyn Navy Yard and would be off the grid. A part of her ached with his absence, wishing she had someone in her corner to buffer the relentless snobbery of the Carmichael clan. The ceremony went off flawlessly. Vows were exchanged under a massive arch of imported white orchids. The string quartet played Vivaldi. Preston smiled for the cameras, though Clara noticed a distinct bead of sweat on his forehead that the flash photography kept catching. Richard Carmichael sat in the front row, his face a thunderous mask of irritation, constantly checking his Patek Philippe watch as if the wedding was a tedious business meeting, keeping him from real work. By 7 in the evening, the 200 guests had transitioned to the grand ballroom for the reception. The room was a masterpiece of opulence. Crystal centerpieces, towering floral arrangements, and a 5-tier cake that cost more than Clara's annual salary. Clara took her seat at the head table, forcing a smile as Preston's aunt leaned over to loudly inquire why Clara wasn't married yet, asking if she was holding out for someone with a proper pedigree. Clara simply took a long sip of her Dom Perignon and ignored the insult. The best man finished his speech, a meandering toast about Preston's college days at Yale, and the staff began pouring more champagne for the main course. Then the doors to the ballroom opened. It wasn't a dramatic, forceful entrance, but rather a smooth, deliberate opening that immediately caught the attention of the maitre d'. The head waiter stepped forward to intercept the late arrivals, but froze in his tracks. The string quartet, situated near the entrance, was the first to realize something was deeply wrong. The cellist's bow stopped mid-stroke. The violinist faltered, hitting a sharp, discordant note before pulling her instrument away. Silence rippled through the room like a shock wave. It started at the back tables and swept forward, an infectious, suffocating wave of quiet. Laughter died in the throats of hedge fund managers. Socialites lowered their crystal glasses to the linen tablecloths. Clara turned her head, her breath catching in her throat. Dominic Cavallo stood in the doorway. He was dressed in a razor-sharp, midnight blue tuxedo that looked lethal on his broad frame. His dark hair was slicked back, his expression completely unreadable. Behind him stood 4 men, massive and immovable, their eyes scanning the ballroom with the cold, calculating efficiency of predators assessing a herd. The silence was deafening. Every eye in the room was fixed on the entrance. In the circles of New York's elite high finance, everyone knew who Dominic Cavallo was. They might not have invited him to their country clubs, but they knew the rumors. They knew about the bodies found in the East River. They knew about the hostile takeovers that ended with CEOs fleeing the country. At the head table, the reaction was violent. Preston dropped his silver fork. It hit the porcelain plate with a sharp clack that echoed loudly in the silent room. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. He gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. But it was Richard Carmichael who truly broke the silence. The imposing, arrogant patriarch of the Carmichael family stood up so fast his heavy mahogany chair tipped over backward, crashing onto the marble floor. "What the hell is this?" Richard breathed, his voice trembling with a mixture of outrage and sheer, unadulterated terror. Dominic didn't look at Richard. He didn't look at Preston. His dark eyes swept the room, entirely unfazed by the collective panic of 200 billionaires, until his gaze locked onto the emerald green dress at the head table. Clara sat frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. He came. Dominic began to walk forward, his polished shoes silent against the thick carpet. His men stayed at the doors, essentially blocking the only exit. As Dominic moved past the tables, people physically leaned away from him, shrinking back in their chairs. He walked straight towards the head table. Chloe was clutching Preston's arm, whimpering softly, completely unaware of the connection between the mob boss and her sister. Dominic stopped a few feet from the bridal party. He reached inside his tuxedo jacket. 3 security guards in the corner of the room instinctively reached for their holsters, but stopped when Dominic's men at the door subtly shifted their coats. Dominic pulled out a small black velvet box. He didn't hand it to Clara. He didn't hand it to the bride. He placed it directly in front of Preston Carmichael. "Congratulations on the wedding, Preston," Dominic said. His voice was calm, smooth, and laced with absolute venom. "I believe this belongs to your father. But considering you just married into my family, I thought I'd deliver the debt in person." The entire room held its breath. Clara stared at Dominic, the words echoing in her mind. "Married into my family." Preston stared at the black box as if it were a live grenade. He slowly reached out with a trembling hand and popped the lid open. Whatever was inside made Preston release a ragged, sobbing gasp. He covered his mouth, tears instantly springing to his eyes as Richard Carmichael collapsed into his chair, utterly defeated. Dominic finally turned his gaze to Clara, a slow, dark smirk playing on his lips. "You look beautiful, amore mio. Shall we dance?" The silence in the grand ballroom of the Pierre was absolute, save for the ragged, hyperventilating breaths escaping Preston's pale lips. He stared down at the small black velvet box, as if a venomous snake were coiled inside. Inside the box rested 2 items. The first was a heavy platinum money clip engraved with the Carmichael family crest. It was heavily tarnished with dark, dried blood. The second was a sleek, encrypted titanium USB drive. To the confused wedding guests craning their necks from the back tables, it looked like a bizarre, morbid wedding gift. But to Richard Carmichael, who was currently clutching his chest in the overturned chair, and to Preston, whose immaculate Tom Ford tuxedo suddenly felt like a straitjacket, those two items represented the end of their lives as they knew them. The blood-stained money clip had belonged to Gregory Hayes, not Clara and Chloe's father, but a distant cousin of the Carmichaels who operated as their offshore fixer in the Cayman Islands. Gregory had officially gone missing at sea off the coast of Grand Cayman 3 weeks prior. The official police report cited a tragic boating accident. The money clip told a very different story. The USB drive, however, was the true weapon. It contained the unredacted ledgers of the Carmichael hedge fund, specifically the shadow accounts held at Cayman National Bank. "What did you do?" Chloe whispered, her voice cracking as she looked from the bloody metal in the box to her new husband's terrified face. "Preston, what is that?" Preston couldn't speak. His eyes darted to Dominic, filled with a pathetic, animalistic panic. Dominic ignored the groom completely. He kept his dark, unwavering gaze fixed on Clara. He extended his hand, the stark white cuff of his shirt peeking out from his tailored midnight blue jacket. "I asked for a dance, Clara," Dominic said, his voice a low rumble that carried effortlessly through the quiet room. Clara's mind was racing. The man she knew, the man who drank black coffee in her Chelsea studio and gently ran his fingers over centuries-old canvas, was entirely submerged beneath the terrifying aura of the Cavallo Syndicate boss. Yet, looking into his eyes, she saw the same fierce protection she had come to rely on. He wasn't doing this to hurt her. He was doing this to expose them. Slowly, deliberately, Clara stood up. Her emerald green silk gown cascaded around her as she stepped away from the head table. She ignored her sister's frantic grasp. She ignored the horrified gasps of the society matrons at the front tables. She placed her small hand into Dominic's large, calloused one. His grip was firm, warm, and unapologetic. He pulled her gently but decisively towards the center of the empty mahogany dance floor. Dominic snapped his fingers once. The sharp sound echoed like a gunshot. He looked over his shoulder at the paralyzed string quartet. "Play," he commanded. "Tchaikovsky, Waltz of the Flowers." The lead violinist, her hands visibly trembling, hurriedly raised her instrument. A moment later, the sweeping, elegant notes of Tchaikovsky filled the tense air. The juxtaposition was dizzying. A beautiful, romantic waltz playing over a room held hostage by fear. Dominic pulled Clara close, his hand resting firmly on the small of her back. They began to move, gliding across the floors with practiced, effortless grace. "You're insane," Clara whispered fiercely, her lips barely moving as she kept a neutral expression for the hundreds of terrified eyes watching them. "Dominic, there are 200 people here. The police commissioner is sitting at table 4. Commissioner Higgins is currently texting his chief of staff to wipe his personal phone," Dominic replied smoothly, twirling her. "He took $300,000 in campaign contributions from my father's shell companies in 2018. He won't lift a finger. In fact, he's probably praying I don't look his way." Clara missed a step, but Dominic caught her, seamlessly supporting her weight. "What is in that box, Dominic? What is going on?" Dominic pulled her slightly closer, the scent of his expensive Creed Aventus cologne wrapping around her. "Your new father-in-law is a thief, Clara. Richard Carmichael likes to project the image of a Wall Street titan, but his fund has been bleeding money for 5 years. To cover his margin calls, he started laundering money. 2 years ago, he took on a new client." "You," Clara breathed, the realization dawning on her. "My syndicate," Dominic corrected, his eyes darkening. "We gave him $50 million of clean capital to invest in a commercial real estate portfolio in Dubai. A safe, secure wash. Instead, Richard got greedy. He took our money and dumped it into a high-risk tech startup that went bankrupt last month. He lost all 50 million, and then he tried to hide it. Clara glanced over Dominic's shoulder at the head table. Richard was still on the floor, surrounded by a few panicked groomsmen, clutching his chest. Preston was staring at Clara with a look of utter, devastating guilt. He sent his fixer to the Caymans to scrub the accounts and falsify the ledgers, Dominic continued, his voice dangerously soft as they spun across the floor. My men intercepted him. The USB in that box contains the proof of every cent Richard has stolen, not just from me, but from his legitimate investors. By tomorrow morning, the SEC and the FBI will have anonymous copies. The Carmichael Empire is dead. Clara's heart ached, not for Richard, but for her twin. Chloe didn't know, Clara said urgently. Dominic, she had no idea. You've ruined her wedding. Dominic stopped dancing. The music continued to swell around them, but they stood perfectly still in the center of the room. He looked down at her, a muscle jumping in his jaw. Chloe might not have known, Dominic said softly, but Preston did. Clara stared at him, her brow furrowing in confusion. Preston? Preston is a coward. He just does whatever his father tells him. Preston is a coward, Dominic agreed, slowly leading her off the dance floor and toward the shadowy alcove near the massive arched windows overlooking Central Park. His 4 men remained at the doors, standing like marble statues, ensuring no one dared to pull a fire alarm or sneak out a side exit. But cowards are dangerous when they're backed into a corner. Dominic signaled to one of his men, a towering enforcer named Silas, whose tailored suit barely contained his bulk. Silas stepped forward, walked directly to the head table, and grabbed Preston by the scruff of his tuxedo jacket. Preston let out a pathetic yelp as he was hauled to his feet and dragged across the ballroom, his polished shoes slipping on the marble. Silas dumped Preston at Dominic and Clara's feet. Tell her, Dominic ordered, his voice echoing with absolute authority. Preston stayed on his knees, shivering violently. He looked up at Clara, his eyes red-rimmed and leaking tears. The golden boy of Wall Street looked entirely broken. I didn't want to do it, Clara, Preston sobbed, running a shaking hand through his perfectly styled hair. My father made me. When we lost the Cavallo money, my dad said we were dead men. He said Dominic would slaughter us. Get to the point, Preston, Dominic growled, stepping closer. Preston flinched violently, shrinking back against the velvet drapes. I hired a private investigator, Preston blurted out, the words tumbling over each other, 3 months ago, to find a weakness, anything we could use to negotiate with the Cavallo family. The PI followed Dominic's movements. He found out Dominic was visiting a restoration studio in Chelsea late at night. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. A cold, heavy sickness settled in her stomach. She looked at Preston, her vision tunneling. You followed him to me. When I realized who you were, Preston cried, looking entirely pathetic. When I realized you were Chloe's sister. It was the perfect shield. My dad said if we brought you into the family, if I married Chloe, Dominic wouldn't touch us. He wouldn't kill the family of the woman he was sleeping with. The air in Clara's lungs vanished. The lavish wedding, the rushed 6-month engagement, Preston's sudden and intense devotion to her sister, Richard Carmichael's sudden willingness to pay for a $500,000 wedding for a girl from a middle-class background. It was all a calculated, desperate lie. They didn't love Chloe. They were using her as a human meat shield to protect themselves from the Mafia. You son of a bitch, Clara whispered, stepping forward. For the first time in her life, she felt a surge of pure, unadulterated violence. She raised her hand and slapped Preston across the face with everything she had. The sharp crack of the slap echoed through the silent ballroom. Preston fell sideways, clutching his cheek, whimpering. From the head table, Chloe let out a piercing scream. She gathered the heavy skirts of her Bertha gown and sprinted across the dance floor, throwing herself onto the floor next to her new husband. Clara, stop it! What are you doing? Chloe shrieked, tears ruining her flawless makeup. She glared up at Dominic, entirely oblivious to the danger she was in. "Who do you think you are? Get out of my wedding!" Clara looked down at her twin sister, her heart breaking into a million pieces. "Chloe, he doesn't love you," Clara said, her voice shaking with raw emotion. "He married you to get to me." Chloe froze, her hands hovering over Preston's shoulders. She looked from Clara to Preston, and then up to Dominic. "What are you talking about?" "Tell your wife, Preston," Dominic commanded, his eyes cold and unforgiving. "Tell her why you rushed the wedding." Preston couldn't look his new bride in the eye. He stared at the carpet, his silence speaking louder than any confession. Chloe's breath hitched. She slowly backed away from him, the realization washing over her like a bucket of ice water. The fairy tale was a fraud. "You used me," Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible. "You used my sister." Before Preston could answer, a loud commotion erupted at the back of the ballroom. The heavy mahogany doors pushed inward, and Silas and the other enforcers suddenly tensed, reaching beneath their jackets. A new figure pushed through the crowd of terrified guests. It was a woman, impeccably dressed in a sharp maroon pantsuit, holding a leather briefcase. Behind her walked 3 men wearing windbreakers with bold yellow letters across the back. FBI. The room erupted into panicked murmurs. Commissioner Higgins at table 4 suddenly looked very ill. Special Agent Beatrice Sterling walked directly into the center of the room, completely ignoring the wealth and status surrounding her. She locked eyes with Dominic. "Cavallo," Agent Sterling said, her voice sharp and authoritative. "You're a long way from Brooklyn." Dominic didn't even flinch. He simply offered a polite, entirely mocking smile. "Agent Sterling, what a pleasant surprise. I believe you're crashing the wrong party. The criminals you're looking for are right over there." Dominic pointed a lazy finger toward Richard Carmichael, who was now being fanned by his frantic wife. Agent Sterling held up a manila folder. "We received an anonymous data dump an hour ago. Offshore ledgers, wire transfers, and a very interesting confession from a Mr. Gregory Hayes. But I don't care about Wall Street fraud right now, Dominic. I care about the $50 million of cartel money that passed through those accounts. Money that traces back to you." Dominic's smirk didn't fade. "I'm a legitimate businessman, Agent. Cavallo Logistics operates entirely within the law. If Mr. Carmichael decided to mingle my clean shipping profits with unsavory funds, that sounds like a failure of his fiduciary duty." Agent Sterling's eyes narrowed. "We have a warrant for Richard Carmichael's arrest, and we're bringing you in for questioning, Dominic." Clara's heart dropped. She grabbed Dominic's arm. He looked down at her, his expression softening just a fraction, a silent promise passing between them. He had known the FBI was coming. He had orchestrated the entire data leak. But as Agent Sterling's men moved to handcuff a sobbing Richard Carmichael, Preston suddenly scrambled to his feet. His eyes were wild, darting around the room. He realized his life was over. He was going to federal prison, or worse, he was going to end up in the East River. Desperation makes men do foolish things. Preston lunged forward, not toward the FBI agents, but toward the nearest table. He snatched a heavy, serrated steak knife from the silver table setting, spun around, and grabbed the nearest person to him. He didn't grab Clara. He grabbed Chloe. Preston yanked his new bride backward, wrapping his arm tightly around her throat and pressing the jagged edge of the steak knife directly against her jugular. "Nobody move!" Preston screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I'll kill her! I swear to God, I'll kill her!" The ballroom erupted into chaos. Women screamed, chairs were knocked over, and the FBI agents immediately drew their sidearms, aiming them directly at the groom. Dominic's demeanor instantly shifted. The calm, calculated mob boss vanished. His eyes went pitch black, a terrifying, lethal rage radiating from him. He stepped in front of Clara, physically shielding her with his body as his hand slipped inside his tuxedo jacket, wrapping around the cold steel of his own weapon. "Preston," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, demonic whisper. "Drop the knife, or I promise you, the FBI won't be the ones taking you out of this room." The grand ballroom of the Pierre, a space that had hosted presidents, royalty, and century-old galas, devolved into a terrifying tableau of violence. The crystal chandeliers overhead seemed to mock the grim reality unfolding below. The scent of expensive florists' imported orchids mixed sickeningly with the metallic tang of fear. Preston Carmichael, a man whose greatest previous stress was a dip in the Nasdaq, was completely unhinged. The heavy serrated silver steak knife trembled violently against Chloe's neck. A thin line of crimson had already welled up where the jagged edge pressed into her porcelain skin, staining the intricate lace collar of her custom Bertha gown. Chloe was frozen. Her chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths, her eyes wide with a terror so absolute it robbed her of her voice. "Back off!" "No!" Preston screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, hysterical register. He dragged Chloe another step backward, his polished shoes skidding slightly on a spilled puddle of Dom Perignon. "I'll cut her! I'm walking out of here and she's coming with me." Special Agent Beatrice Sterling didn't flinch. She stood with her feet planted shoulder-width apart, her Glock 19 leveled squarely at the bridge of Preston's nose. The 3 FBI agents behind her fanned out, their weapons drawn, creating a semicircle of lethal force. "Preston, listen to me," Agent Sterling said, her voice projecting with the calm, flat authority of a seasoned hostage negotiator. "You are making a federal wire fraud case into a violent felony. If you harm her, you will not see the inside of a courtroom. You will leave this hotel in a body bag. Drop the knife." Over by the head table, the situation was equally chaotic. Richard Carmichael's face had turned an alarming shade of ashen grey. He clutched his chest, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish before his eyes rolled back. He collapsed heavily onto the marble floor, completely unresponsive. His wife shrieked, falling to her knees to administer frantic, ineffective CPR. Preston glanced at his father's crumpled body, and whatever tiny fragment of sanity he had left completely evaporated. "I need a car!" Preston yelled, entirely ignoring the FBI. He locked eyes with Dominic. "You, Cavallo, tell your men to open those doors. Tell them to get out of my way." Dominic stood directly in front of Clara, effectively shielding her from any stray bullets. His own hand rested casually inside his midnight blue tuxedo jacket, gripping the handle of his customized Sig Sauer. To the untrained eye, Dominic looked relaxed. But Clara, standing inches behind him, could feel the murderous tension radiating from his solid frame. He was a coiled spring. "You're a dead man, Preston," Dominic said softly. He didn't shout over the crying guests or the shouting agents. He didn't have to. The chilling, absolute certainty in his gravelly baritone cut through the noise like a razor. "You brought a butter knife to a gunfight, and you made the fatal mistake of touching someone I consider family." "She's my wife!" Preston shrieked, tightening his grip. Chloe let out a choked sob. Clara couldn't stay behind Dominic any longer. The sight of her twin sister, the girl she had shared secrets with, the girl she had protected from high school bullies and bad breakups, being used as a human shield by a Wall Street coward, tore her apart. She stepped out from behind Dominic's broad shoulders, ignoring his sharp command to stay back. "Preston, look at me," Clara pleaded, her voice ringing out across the tense space. She raised her hands in a placating gesture, her emerald silk dress rustling as she took a slow step forward. "This is between you and Dominic. This is about your father's debt. Chloe has nothing to do with this. She didn't know about the Caymans. She didn't know about the Cavallo Syndicate. Let her go and take me." "Clara, no!" Dominic snarled, his hand snapping out to grab her arm, pulling her back with a grip like a steel vice. Agent Sterling briefly took her eyes off Preston to glare at Clara. "Ma'am, step back immediately. You are interfering with a federal standoff," but Preston laughed. A jagged, breathless sound that bordered on manic. "Take you? The Mafia boss's girlfriend? He'd shoot me before I took 2 steps. No, Chloe is my insurance. As long as I have her, Cavallo won't authorize a hit, and you feds won't shoot." He began to drag Chloe towards the heavy service doors near the kitchen, a desperate plan forming in his fractured mind. If he could get to the freight elevators, he might be able to lose them in the labyrinthine service corridors of the Pierre. Dominic's jaw tightened. He shot a nearly imperceptible look at Silas, the massive enforcer standing near the main entrance. Silas gave a fractional nod. The syndicate men were calculating angles, waiting for the split second Preston's head cleared Chloe's silhouette. But Chloe Hayes was not just a pageant queen. She was Clara's sister. And beneath the superficial obsession with high society, she possessed the same stubborn survivor's grit that ran in their blood. As Preston dragged her backward, Chloe suddenly went entirely limp. She dropped her entire body weight, adding the heavy, voluminous layers of her crystal-beaded Bertha gown, forcing Preston to suddenly support 130 pounds of dead weight. The sudden shift threw Preston severely off balance. As Preston stumbled, his grip loosened for a fraction of a second. The serrated knife pulled a millimeter away from her throat. That was all Chloe needed. With a feral scream that echoed off the vaulted ceiling, Chloe violently threw her head backward, smashing her skull directly into the bridge of Preston's nose. The sickening crunch of cartilage snapping was loud enough to be heard over the panicked crowd. Preston howled in agony, his hands flying to his ruined face as blood instantly poured over his lips and chin. The silver steak knife clattered harmlessly to the floor. Chloe scrambled forward on her hands and knees, desperate to get away from him. The FBI agent surged forward, screaming commands. But Dominic was faster. He moved with a terrifying, predatory speed that defied his large frame. He didn't draw his weapon. Instead, he crossed the 10 feet, separating them in 2 massive strides. Before Preston could even wipe the blood from his eyes, Dominic's hand clamped around the groom's throat. With brutal, effortless strength, Dominic lifted Preston completely off the ground and slammed him backward onto the nearest dining table. Crystal centerpieces shattered. Silverware flew into the air. The heavy table groaned under the impact as Dominic pinned the thrashing man down. "Dominic, back away! FBI!" Agent Sterling barked, closing the distance with her weapon raised. Dominic ignored her. He leaned in, his face inches from Preston's bloody, terrified visage. "This is for using her," Dominic whispered, his voice a lethal hiss. Dominic raised his right fist and brought it down like a hammer directly onto Preston's left collarbone. The bone shattered with a wet snap. Preston's scream of agony was abruptly cut off as he passed out from the pain, his body going completely limp amidst the ruined wedding cake and shattered glass. The immediate aftermath was a blur of flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the marble exterior of the hotel on Central Park South. NYPD cruisers barricaded the street, holding back a growing swarm of paparazzi and curious onlookers. Inside, the grand wedding had transformed into a massive crime scene. EMTs rushed past the gilded mirrors with stretchers. Richard Carmichael, clinging to life after a massive myocardial infarction, was loaded into an ambulance bound for Lenox Hill Hospital under heavy police guard. Preston, his face bandaged and his arms stabilized in a temporary sling, was frog-marched out the front doors in handcuffs by 2 stern-faced federal agents. He didn't look back. Clara sat on a velvet settee in the hotel's private library, holding a glass of ice water she hadn't touched. Across from her, Chloe was wrapped in a thick wool blanket provided by a paramedic. The delicate lace of her wedding dress was ruined, stained with Preston's blood and her own tears. A medic had placed a small butterfly bandage over the shallow cut on her neck. "I can't believe it," Chloe whispered, her voice hollow. She stared blankly at her 3-carat diamond engagement ring. Slowly, deliberately, she pulled it off her finger and placed it on the antique coffee table. It was all a lie. The dinners, the trips to Nantucket, the vows. He was just trying to save his own pathetic life. Clara moved to sit next to her twin, wrapping an arm around Chloe's trembling shoulders. "I am so sorry, Chloe. If I had known—" "Known what?" Chloe let out a bitter, exhausted laugh. "That you were dating the head of a criminal syndicate? Clara, how could you keep this from me? You restore paintings, you eat takeout and watch documentaries. Since when do you date men who command private armies and bankrupt hedge funds?" Clara looked down at her hands. "It wasn't planned. I met him at work, and he's different with me." "He shattered a man's collarbone with his bare hands in front of the FBI," Chloe pointed out, though there was no accusation in her tone, only profound shock. "Clara, he is incredibly dangerous." "I know," Clara said softly, "but he protected us today. He exposed them before you were legally tied to their debt." Before Chloe could respond, the heavy oak doors of the library opened. Agent Beatrice Sterling walked in, looking exasperated, followed closely by Dominic. Dominic's tuxedo jacket was unbuttoned, and he looked entirely unruffled, as if he had just finished a pleasant dinner rather than a hostage situation. "Are you ladies unharmed?" Agent Sterling asked, her sharp eyes scanning the sisters. "We're fine," Clara said, standing up. "Good, because your ex-fiancé just sang like a canary in the back of my cruiser," Agent Sterling said, looking at Chloe. "The Carmichael family is finished. The SEC is freezing every asset they own by midnight." The agent then turned her hardened gaze to Dominic. "As for you, Cavallo, you covered your tracks perfectly. The $50 million was legally documented as a high-risk venture capital loan through a shell corporation in Delaware. You're technically a victim of fraud." Dominic offered a slight, mocking bow. "I trust the justice system to recover my stolen capital, Agent Sterling." Agent Sterling scoffed. "Don't play games with me. You orchestrated this entire spectacle. You tipped us off, you humiliated the Carmichaels, and you walked away clean. But I will catch you slipping one day, Dominic. Count on it." "I look forward to the challenge, Beatrice," Dominic replied smoothly. Agent Sterling shook her head in disgust and exited the room, leaving the heavy doors open behind her. Silence descended on the library. Chloe looked at Dominic, shrinking back slightly against the velvet cushions. Dominic didn't approach the bride. He kept his distance out of a rare display of respect, his dark eyes locking entirely on Clara. "My men have secured a perimeter," Dominic said quietly. "There are reporters swarming the lobby. Silas will escort Chloe out through the private loading dock. I have a car waiting to take her to a secure suite at the Mandarin Oriental under a fake name. The press won't find her." Chloe looked up, surprised by the calculated care. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Dominic nodded once, acknowledging her, before turning his full attention to Clara. The hardened, ruthless mob boss stripped away, leaving only the man who had sat in her studio for hours just to watch her paint. "I need to leave the city," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a low, private register. "The fallout from the Carmichael collapse is going to create a power vacuum on Wall Street, and my rivals in the commission will try to exploit the chaos. I have to go to Boston tonight to secure my shipping lines." Clara felt a sudden sharp ache in her chest. "Boston? For how long?" Dominic took a step closer. "That depends, amore mio." He reached out, gently tucking a stray lock of ash-blonde hair behind her ear. His knuckles grazed her cheek, sending a jolt of electricity through her. "I told you from the beginning that my world is violent. I tried to keep it away from you, but today the shadows touched you. You saw exactly who I am, and exactly what I am capable of." Clara looked up into his obsidian eyes. She remembered the terrifying ease with which he had incapacitated Preston, but she also remembered the way he had stepped in front of her to take a bullet, entirely without hesitation. "I'm giving you an out, Clara," Dominic said, and for the first time, Clara heard a trace of vulnerability in his voice. "If you walk out of this hotel with your sister, you go back to your quiet life. You restore your art. You never see my face again. and you will be perfectly safe. I will ensure no one from my world ever approaches you." He paused, his jaw tightening. He dropped his hand from her face. "But if you walk out those doors with me, you are stepping into the dark permanently. There is no going back. You will be the woman beside the head of the Cavallo Syndicate. You will have a target on your back, and you will live with ghosts." Dominic extended his right hand toward her, palm open. "The choice is yours. Are you staying in the light, Clara? Or are you coming with me?" The private library of the Pierre Hotel was suffocatingly quiet. The faint, muffled sounds of police sirens and frantic reporters out on Fifth Avenue barely penetrated the thick mahogany doors, but inside the room, the silence was absolute. Clara stood frozen, her eyes locked on Dominic's extended hand. The stark white cuff of his shirt and the dark, expensive wool of his tuxedo jacket seemed to represent the exact dichotomy of the man himself. A brutal, violent darkness, wrapped in an immaculate, civilized exterior. She looked back at her twin sister. Chloe sat on the velvet settee, the ruined Bertha gown pooling around her like a deflated parachute. Chloe's perfect, curated life had just been violently dismantled in the span of 2 hours. She had chased the glittering illusion of the Carmichael family's wealth, only to discover it was built on a foundation of theft, lies, and a desperate cowardice that almost cost her her life. The light, Clara realized with a sudden, crystal-clear clarity, was a lie. Preston and Richard Carmichael attended charity galas at the Met, summered in the Hamptons, and wore Patek Philippe watches, yet they were fundamentally corrupt. They had traded her life, and Chloe's, to save their own skin. Dominic, on the other hand, made no excuses for what he was. He was a monster to his enemies, a phantom to the FBI, and a ruthless operator in the criminal underworld. But he had never lied to her. He had walked into a room full of federal agents and billionaires to protect her. He had shattered the man's bones to keep her safe. "Clara," Chloe whispered, her voice cracking. She pulled the wool blanket tighter around her trembling shoulders. She looked at Dominic, true fear in her hazel eyes, and then back to her twin. "If you go with him, you can't come back. The FBI, the press, the danger. It will follow you forever." "I know," Clara said softly. She turned back to Dominic. His dark, obsidian eyes searched her face, waiting. There was no pressure, no command in his posture. For the first time since he had kicked open the ballroom doors, the mob boss was completely vulnerable. He was giving her a genuine choice. Clara took a deep breath, the scent of expensive orchids and Dominic's Creed Aventus cologne filling her lungs. She reached out, her fingers trembling just slightly, and placed her small, paint-stained hand firmly into his large, calloused palm. Dominic's eyes flared with an intense, possessive heat. His fingers immediately closed around hers, his grip solid, warm, and anchoring. A heavy sigh escaped his lips, a sound of profound relief that he quickly masked beneath his hardened exterior. "Silas," Dominic called out over his shoulder. The massive enforcer immediately stepped into the doorway. "Boss? Take Chloe through the service corridors to the loading dock. The armored Escalade is waiting. Get her to the Mandarin Oriental and put 4 men on her door. No one gets in or out without my personal authorization." Dominic looked directly at Chloe. "You are under the protection of the Cavallo family now, Chloe. No one will ever touch you again." Chloe swallowed hard, slowly nodding. "Thank you." Clara squeezed her sister's shoulder one last time. "I'll call you as soon as I can. I love you, Chloe." "I love you too." "Be careful, Clara," Chloe whispered, tears spilling over her eyelashes as Silas gently guided her out of the room. Once they were alone, Dominic pulled Clara flush against his chest, his arms wrapped around her waist, burying his face into her ash-blonde hair. For a brief, stolen moment, the ruthless syndicate head simply held her, drawing strength from her presence. "You're sure?" he murmured against her ear, his breath warm. Once we walk out of this hotel, Clara, the world is going to know you belong to me. Agent Sterling will open a file on you. My rivals will know your name." Clara leaned back, looking up into his dark eyes. A fierce, unyielding resolve settled in her chest. Preston Carmichael thought I was a weakness he could exploit. Let's show them exactly how wrong he was. A slow, wicked smile spread across Dominic's face. It was the smile of a predator who had just secured his most prized possession. "Let's go." Dominic kept her hand firmly in his as they exited the library. They didn't sneak out through the back. Dominic Cavallo did not hide. They walked directly through the grand lobby of the Pierre. The remaining wedding guests, the hedge fund managers, the socialites, the corrupt politicians, parted like the Red Sea. Whispers erupted as Clara, the bride's twin sister in her striking emerald gown, walked hand in hand with the city's most feared crime boss. As they pushed through the rotating brass doors and stepped out onto Fifth Avenue, the night exploded in a blinding array of camera flashes. The paparazzi had descended like vultures. NYPD officers struggled to hold back the screaming reporters, all desperate for a quote about the sudden arrest of Wall Street titan Richard Carmichael and the bloody hostage situation. Dominic didn't say a word. His enforcers formed a tight, impenetrable wall around them, forcefully shoving aside a photographer who got too close. Dominic handed Clara into the back of his idling, heavily armored Mercedes Maybach, climbing in right behind her. "Teterboro," Dominic ordered the driver as the heavy doors slammed shut, instantly cutting off the chaos of the flashing lights and screaming press. "Step on it!" The Maybach surged forward, blending into the midnight traffic of the FDR drive. Clara leaned her head against Dominic's shoulder as the Manhattan skyline blurred past the tinted windows. The fallout over the next 6 months was entirely unprecedented. The USB drive Dominic had delivered to the wedding was a masterclass in financial destruction. It contained thousands of encrypted files, offshore bank routes, and recorded conversations between Richard Carmichael and his Cayman Islands fixer. It took the SEC less than 48 hours to entirely liquidate the Carmichael hedge fund. Richard Carmichael survived his heart attack, only to wake up handcuffed to a hospital bed at Lenox Hill. He was subsequently indicted on 47 counts of federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering. He was sentenced to 25 years at FCI Otisville, a federal prison where his former country club memberships meant absolutely nothing. Preston Carmichael's fate was arguably worse. After having his collarbone surgically reconstructed, he was offered a plea deal by Agent Beatrice Sterling in exchange for testifying against his father. Preston took it immediately, cementing his legacy as a coward. He served 3 years in a minimum security facility before being released into absolute obscurity, bankrupt, disgraced, and utterly alone. Chloe Hayes took her time to heal. With Dominic's silent, heavy financial backing, laundered perfectly through an anonymous trust, she opened a high-end bridal boutique in Soho. She left the superficial world of old money socialites behind, finding a quiet, fierce independence she never knew she possessed. As for Clara, stepping into the dark didn't mean losing herself. It meant adapting. 6 months after the wedding, Clara stood in the sun-drenched conservatory of a sprawling, heavily guarded stone estate in Newport, Rhode Island. The Atlantic Ocean crashed against the cliffs below. She wore a simple silk blouse and slacks, a pair of magnifying loupes pushed up on her forehead. Before her rested a supposedly authenticated 19th century Monet. The heavy mahogany doors of the conservatory opened, and Dominic walked in. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, looking every inch the lethal, untouchable boss he was. The Boston expansion had been brutal, but successful. The Cavallo Syndicate was now the undisputed power on the eastern seaboard. Dominic walked up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What's the verdict, amore mio?" Clara picked up a small vial of solvent and a cotton swab. She gently rubbed a tiny, inconspicuous corner of the canvas. The century-old paint immediately dissolved, revealing a bright, synthetic, polymer blue beneath it. "It's a fake, Dominic," Clara said, a sharp smile playing on her lips. Acrylic underneath the oil layer. The Russian Bratva is trying to pay off their shipping debt to you with forged art. They thought you wouldn't know the difference. Dominic let out a low, dark chuckle, kissing the side of her neck. They severely underestimated my greatest asset. Clara leaned back into his embrace, looking out at the crashing grey waves of the Atlantic. The world she lived in now was dangerous, filled with shadows, federal agents, and ruthless enemies. But as Dominic's arms held her tight, she knew she had never been safer. The light had been an illusion, but the darkness was home. When you strip away the designer gowns and the $500,000 weddings, you quickly learn that true monsters don't always lurk in the shadows. Sometimes they wear tailored suits and sit at the head of a Wall Street boardroom. Clara risked everything by bringing Dominic into the light, and in return, he burned the corrupt Carmichael empire to the ground. She chose a life of dangerous truths over comfortable lies, proving that sometimes the only way to protect your family is to align with the ultimate villain. If this intense mafia romance kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button and share this story with anyone who loves a good wedding day revenge plot. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss a dramatic twist. Drop a comment below. Would you have taken Dominic's hand and stepped into the dark? See you in the next video.